Wyoming Territory, June 1882. The river had nearly taken her when Zephaniah Granger found her half submerged, lips blue, gown soaked and tangled in willow roots. He hauled her from the current with both arms wrapped tight around her waist, like if he let go, the Snake River would drag her back under. She gasped hard as air hit her lungs, coughing water trembling all over. Her wrists were scraped raw, her eyes wide, wild and brown like churned earth locked on him. "It's all right," he said low, steady. "You're safe now." She tried to sit up, but pain seized her ribs. He caught her before she slumped. "My name's Zephaniah," he said. "You can call me Zep." She blinked slowly, teeth chattering. "Glenna," she rasped. "Glenna James." Zep looked back at the river. The bank was torn with fresh boot prints, his jaw clenched. "Was someone with you?" she nodded, barely. "My husband. He held me under." Zep's grip around her tightened. He got her onto his horse, wrapping his coat around her shoulders, and rode hard for his ranch, set 15 miles west near the Wind River foothills. By the time they reached it, she was barely awake. His cabin was small but clean, one room, sturdy walls, a stone hearth. He laid her gently on his bed and stoked the fire high. For a long while she just lay there, eyes closed, while he knelt beside her, wiping mud from her face with a damp cloth. Glenna did not speak again that night. She flinched when he brought water to her lips, and when he brushed her wet hair from her forehead, her breath caught like she expected pain. Zep moved slow. He knew horses better than people, but he could see when something had been broken. The next morning she woke to the smell of coffee. She sat up quick, blanket clutched to her chest. Zep was across the room, stirring something on the stove. "You are safe here," he said without turning. "No one will ever hurt you again." She stared at him. "You do not know me," she said. He finally looked over. "You were drowning. I pulled you out because no one deserves to be left like that." Glenna looked down at her hands, fingers trembling. "I have nothing," she said. "No clothes, no money, no family left." Zep walked over, crouched beside her again. "You are not nothing," he said. "You are a woman who survived. That means something." Her eyes welled up, but she blinked fast, refusing the tears. He stood. "Eat what you can. I will be outside." She ate slowly, watching him through the window as he split wood. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sunburned skin and dark hair that curled at the ends. His movements were calm, measured, like he had long ago learned not to waste energy. There was no wedding ring on his hand. That afternoon, Zep came inside holding a folded dress. "Belonged to my sister," he said as he held it out. "She passed 3 winters ago. I kept some of her things." Glenna took it with both hands, voice quiet. "Thank you." He nodded once and stepped out again. Over the next few days, she moved careful around him, always watching, always wary. But he never raised his voice, never stepped too close. Just kept the fire going, kept food on the table, and left his bed to her while he slept on a cot near the door. On the 4th morning, she found him just before dawn, saddling his horse. "Where are you going?" she asked. His voice was even. "Town. Someone ought to know what your husband did." She stiffened. "He is still out there." "I know," Zep said. "That is why I am going." She stared at him, panic surfacing, but he met her gaze steady. "I will not be long. No one is coming near you while I am breathing." She nodded, barely. He returned by nightfall, bloodied but standing. Glenna's eyes widened when she saw the gash above his brow. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to him. "Found your husband drunk in a saloon," he said flatly. "He swung first. I made sure he will not swing again." She stared at him, lips parted. "The sheriff saw what happened. He says you are free to stay, no charges against you." Her hands trembled as she reached for a rag to wipe the blood from his face. Zep caught her wrist gently. "You do not have to take care of me," he said. She shook her head. "I want to," he let her. That night she sat near the hearth, legs pulled close to her chest, watching the flames. Zep was across the room, patching his coat. "I used to think love meant staying no matter what," she said softly. "Even when it hurt." Zep looked up. She did not look at him, just stared into the fire. "But he never looked at me like I mattered, just like something he owned." Zep stood and walked over slowly. He crouched in front of her again like the first night. "You do matter," he said. "And no one owns you." Her throat tightened. "Why are you helping me?" He paused, then said, "Because I want to." She reached out, touched the edge of his sleeve, his hand covered hers, warm and strong. "Sleep," he said. "I will be right here," and he was. When she woke from nightmares, he was there. When her hands shook chopping vegetables, he steadied them. When she flinched at thunder, he sat beside her until it passed. Days turned into weeks. Glenna began to smile again, not often, but real. She helped mend fence posts, fed the chickens, even laughed once when Zep cursed at a stubborn cow. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, she walked beside him after supper. The sky was orange and gold. "Why did you never marry?" she asked. He looked out over the land. "Never met someone I would give my life to." She stopped walking. "I think you already did." Zep turned. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "You pulled me from that river, you gave me back my life." He stepped closer. "Glenna," she touched his chest. "You said no one would hurt me again, you meant it." "I did," he said. She rose onto her toes and kissed him. It was not rushed. It was soft, steady, like how he held her when she was shaking, like how he spoke when everything inside her felt broken. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead to hers. "You are the bravest woman I have ever known," he said. And she whispered, "And you are the kindest man." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and this time neither of them pulled away. By late July, the cottonwoods behind the cabin had fully leafed out, their branches casting a lattice of moving shade across the ground. The river, now running slower and clearer with summer's heat, could be heard faintly from the back stoop, where Glenna often sat with her sewing, her feet tucked beneath her skirt. Zep had taken to riding fence early, before the day got too hot. He'd return near noon, sweat darkening the back of his shirt and dust clinging to his boots. Glenna would have a basin of water waiting, and he'd nod his thanks, dipping his hands in without a word. One afternoon, she set her work aside and watched him from the stoop. He was hauling feed to the lean-to, jaw set, eyes scanning the sky like he was tracking the shift of the wind. "You worked for the army once," she said. He paused, one hand on the feed sack. "A long time ago." She stood and stepped closer. "Was it out here, Montana Territory?" "Cavalry post near the Judith River." She folded her arms across her waist. "Did you leave, or were you told to?" He dropped the sack beside the trough. "I left." "Why?" Zep wiped his palms on his trousers but didn't answer right away. "There was a Cheyenne boy, no more than 12. He ran from a patrol, they shot him in the back." His voice stayed even, but his eyes had gone far off. "I buried him myself, turned in my rifle the next day." Glenna's breath caught. "Did you know his name?" No one ever asked. She stepped closer, laid her hand on his arm. "I'm sorry." He looked down at her hand, his voice quieter. "That's part of why I built here. Land used to belong to the Eastern Shoshone before the treaty. I figured the least I could do was live quiet, not take more than I needed." Glenna watched the way he looked out over the pasture, like the land still whispered truths no one else could hear. "You've carried that a long time." He met her eyes. "Some things don't wear off," she nodded. "I know the feeling." Later that evening, as the light faded gold over the hills, Glenna brought a pail of scraps to the hog pen. She moved slower than Zep did, careful where she stepped in the tall grass. Halfway back to the cabin, she paused at the edge of the clearing. There'd been no sign of her husband since Zep returned from town. Still, her eyes swept the tree line every time she stepped out alone. The fear hadn't left. It had only quieted, like a storm waiting in the belly of the sky. "Don't go too far from the porch after dusk," Zep said from behind her. "I don't," she replied, turning toward him. He carried 2 tin mugs, one of which he held out. She took it, the heat of the coffee bleeding through the metal. They stood side by side, watching the last of the sun disappear behind the ridgeline. "I was born in Illinois," she said, keeping her voice low. "Springfield. My father ran a dry goods store. He died of fever when I was 16. My mother passed a year later." Zep took a slow sip. "Did you come west alone?" "I married a man who promised we'd start fresh in Denver. We never got further than Laramie. He drank, lost what little we had, and turned mean." She looked down into her cup. "I stayed too long because I thought I owed him something. It took nearly dying to realize I didn't." Zep didn't speak. He just reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was the first time he'd touched her without necessity. The gesture was small, but it landed deep. "You owe no one anything," he said. Glenna's chest ached in a way that wasn't pain. She stepped closer until she could feel the warmth of him, the solidness. "I've never had quiet like this," she whispered. Not even as a girl. Zep looked down at her, the corners of his eyes lined with sun and time. "It's yours now." "All of it?" She set her mug on the stoop, then reached for his hand. "I want to stay," she said. He looked at her fingers wrapped around his. "Then stay." The next morning, she rose early and made biscuits, her movements still cautious but more certain than before. Zep came in from the barn with a fresh pail of milk, and when their hands brushed at the table, she didn't pull away. That night, she asked to help with the evening chores. He handed her a lantern and walked beside her to the barn. "My sister used to sing while she brushed down the horses," he said as she lit the lantern and hung it on the hook. Glenna smiled faintly. "I can't carry a tune." "Doesn't matter. They like the sound." She reached for a curry comb and stepped into the stall with his gelding. The horse shifted, ears flicking but stilled as she ran the brush along his flank. "I never thought I'd be happy again," she said softly. Zep leaned against the post, watching her. "You are." "I think I am." He crossed the stall and came to stand behind her, close enough she could feel the heat of him through her dress. "You're not alone, Glenna." She turned toward him, the comb loose in her hand. "No." "I'm not." And this time, when she reached for him, it was with her whole heart. August settled in dry and hot. The grass near the river turned brittle, and the creek that fed the lower pasture slowed to a trickle. Glenna had taken to tying her hair back with a strip of calico, and keeping her skirts pinned up when she worked, sweating through the days like she belonged to the land, not just borrowing space from it. Zep had taught her how to check the salt lick and spot signs of colic in the horses. She asked questions, always listening close, not out of politeness but purpose. He noticed the way she watched the cattle as they moved through the draw, how she paused before answering, like she was learning how to measure her words same as she had once measured silence. One morning she found him at the workbench behind the barn with a rifle spread open and cleaned down to the pins. "You expecting trouble?" she asked. He didn't look up. "No, that's why I'm keeping it ready." She stepped closer, hands folded beneath her apron. "You ever want to leave this place?" Zep slid the bolt back into place. "No, not even to see something more." He glanced her way. "I've seen enough." She didn't press. Instead, she sat on the edge of the platform where the hay wagon was parked, legs swinging just above the dirt. "I used to dream about San Francisco," she said. He'd talk about it when he was sober, said the streets were so steep they'd make your knees ache just looking at him. Zep leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed. "You still want to see it?" "Not anymore." She looked out toward the hills. "I don't want cities. I want quiet mornings, a roof that doesn't leak, a man who comes home." Her voice didn't shake, but it softened around the edges. "That's all the world I need now." He pushed off the wall and walked over, standing just below her. "I've never been to a city," he said. "But I know what it means to stay." She tilted her head. "Have you had anyone stay before?" "No." He didn't say more, and she didn't ask. Some truths were enough in their plainness. Later that week, they rode out together to check the north grazing line. Glenna rode a bay mare slow and sure, her back straighter than it had been. The wind tugged at the ends of her sleeves, bringing the sharp scent of sage and sun-baked stone. They dismounted near a dry arroyo where an old cottonwood had fallen last spring. Zep stepped down first and helped her with the saddle cinch, his hands brushing hers only once. "There's tracks here," she said, crouching near the roots. "Not cow or horse." He knelt beside her. "Elk, a few days old." She pointed farther up the slope. "That broken limb, something larger passed through." He looked at her with quiet approval. "You've got an eye for it." She stood and dusted her palms. "I'm learning." That night, a storm rolled in sudden and loud. Rain beat the roof while the two of them sat at the table, a lantern glowing between them. Glenna mended a shirt of his, her stitches neat and small. Zepp carved a length of pine into a new tool handle. "You ever think about children?" she asked without looking up. He set the knife down. "Sometimes." "Would you want them?" He watched her fingers working the needle. "With the right woman, yes." She looked up, her face unreadable in the flickering light. "I never could. They said it was me, something with my body." He blamed me, said I was less of a wife because of it. Zepp didn't speak right away. "I don't see you that way," he said quietly. "I know." Her voice was steady, but her breath caught on the next stitch. He reached across the table, not suddenly, not bold, just enough. She laid her hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, "about building a second room off the back, something with a window that faces the east ridge." She looked at him, eyes searching. "That for me? For us?" She didn't answer, just closed her hand around his like she'd found an anchor worth holding. The next day, she took a basket into the woods behind the cabin and came back with her arms full of chokecherries and wild mint. Zepp watched her boil the leaves, tie the bundles, and hang them near the hearth. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "Older woman I met in Laramie." She said the mint keeps away bad spirits. He raised an eyebrow. She smiled faintly. "I don't know about spirits, but it smells better than sweat and horse." He chuckled under his breath. That evening they sat outside as the sky turned the color of rust and lavender. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he leaned into her without needing a reason. "I never thought I'd belong anywhere again," she said. "You do now." She turned her face toward him, and in the hush between them she whispered, "I want to build that room with you." Zepp reached for her hand, kissed the back of it like it was the most natural thing in the world. "We'll start tomorrow." By early September, the ground had hardened beneath the hooves of Zepp's herd, and the wind began to carry the first edge of cold. The sky stretched wider, clearer, as if the land were holding its breath before the long sleep of winter. A thin line of smoke curled from the chimney most mornings now, and Glenna had taken to baking early, when the stove warmed not just the cabin, but her fingers too. They'd started framing the second room 3 days prior. The work was steady, deliberate, Zepp's hands sure with the saw, Glenna's with the level. She measured twice for every cut and asked questions he hadn't expected. Not just about the building, but about what came after. Where to put the table, how much light came through in spring, whether the north wind would whistle through the seams. Late on the fourth evening, they stood inside the skeleton of the new walls. There was no roof yet, only a clean slice of sky overhead. Glenna tipped her head back and looked up. "It's the first thing I've ever built with my own hands," she said. Zepp rested his hammer against his thigh. "You'll build more than this." She turned to him. "Would you have done any of this if I hadn't washed up in your pasture?" He didn't answer right away. "Then, no, I'd still be sleeping in a house too quiet." She stepped closer, the boards creaking beneath her boots. "I've started dreaming again, not the old kind where I'm running. These ones are still and warm. I think they're about us." Zepp's breath left him slow. "I think I dream the same." The next morning, Glenna rode into Riverton with a list tucked in her apron, nails, lamp oil, flannel for winter shirts. Zepp had offered to go, but she shook her head. "I need to be seen," she said. "Not hidden." She took the wagon, drove it herself, and came back before dusk with the supplies tied down and her chin higher than he'd ever seen it. "I ran into the preacher's wife," she said as she unloaded. "She asked if I was your kin." "What did you tell her?" "That I was your partner, in work and in life." Zepp stilled. "Was she satisfied with that?" She looked at my hands, saw the sawdust under my nails. She smiled and said, "That'll do." That night, with supper cleared away and the fire low, Glenna sat cross-legged on the floor beside a pile of fabric. She was cutting strips for a quilt, the blade of her scissors flashing in the firelight. "I used to think love was loud," she said. "Big words. Big moments, but I never felt safe in any of it." Zepp leaned in the doorway, watching her work. "What does it feel like now?" She looked up. "Like a steady hand on my back when I'm tired, like someone who sees me when I'm not speaking." Zepp crossed the floor and sat beside her. "You're the bravest person I've ever known." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for his face, fingertips brushing the line of his jaw. He leaned into her hand like he'd been waiting for it. "When the room's done," she said softly, "I want to move into it with you, not just sleep there. Live there, together." Zep caught her hand in both of his, held it firm. "I want that too. Every morning, every night." She smiled, not wide but sure. They finished the room 5 days later. The walls were tight against the wind, the window square to the rising sun. Glenna hung a single length of muslin across the glass, and Zep placed a new kerosene lamp on the shelf beside the bed. That first night they stood in the doorway, side by side. "You ready?" he asked. She turned to him, her voice clear. "I've been ready since the day you pulled me from the river." They stepped inside together, closed the door behind them, and didn't look back. From then on, they rose each morning with the light spilling across their quilt, and every evening they returned to that room not as strangers who had survived, but as two people who had chosen to build something lasting from the pieces of what came before. And nothing, not the past, nor the silence it left behind, could take that from them. The first frost came in the middle of the night. Zep woke before dawn to the brittle hush it left behind, the windows laced with a fine layer of ice. Glenna stirred beside him, her breath warm against his shoulder. He waited, listening to the stillness that came only after the land had decided to rest. She blinked awake slowly. "That wind changed," he nodded. "Winter's on its way." They dressed in quiet and lit the stove, their movements practiced but unhurried. Outside, the hills wore a pale silver sheen. The cattle stood heavy and still in the field, their breath rising in soft clouds. By midday, Zep had strung fresh line between the posts near the chicken coop, and Glenna had laid the last of the root vegetables in straw-lined crates in the cellar. She stopped halfway up the steps, brushing soil from her hands. "There's a letter from your cousin in the basket," she said. Zep took it from the table with a glance. "He's been talking about selling his acreage for near 3 years. Always says it, never does it. I think he means it this time. Says he's tired, wants to go back east, live near his daughter." He folded the letter once more. "That land borders ours." Glenna wiped her palms on her apron. "You could buy it, fence it proper, raise more cattle." Zep looked at her across the table. "Would you want that?" "I'd want what you want." She hesitated, then added, "But if we're going to raise something more than cattle, we'll need the room." He stood still for a moment, watching her. "Are you saying," she stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady, "not yet? But someday?" Zep reached for her hand and pressed a kiss to the inside of her wrist. "All right, we'll plan for someday." The next week they rode out to walk the land in question, 2 shallow gullies, a windbreak of spruce, the remains of a sod barn half sunk into the earth. Glenna climbed the slope ahead of him, skirts bundled in one hand, and stood at the top with her face turned into the breeze. He caught up beside her. "It's good ground. It feels open," she said. "Like it hasn't made up its mind yet." He glanced at her sideways. "You have?" She smiled without looking at him. "I have." They made the purchase with the help of the sheriff's clerk, who brought the papers out in a satchel and signed them beneath the cottonwoods, with Zep's mare tied to a post and Glenna kneeling nearby, coaxing a fire to life for coffee. The clerk shook Zep's hand, tipped his hat to Glenna, and rode back toward town before the sun had lowered. That night, Glenna laid the signed deed inside Zep's father's Bible, tucked between the pages near Ezekiel. "He always said land was a promise," Zep muttered as he watched her. She closed the cover gently. "Then we've made one." October brought the kind of cold that stayed in the wood overnight. Glenna sewed linings into their coats by lantern, her stitches precise and firm. Zep built a new stall for the mare, reinforcing the gate with salvaged iron hinges. Snow came early, not heavy but enough to hush the ground. One evening, Glenna came in from the barn holding a folded scrap of canvas. "Found this in the loft. It's strong enough for a cradle sling." Zep looked up from the stove. "You thinking ahead again?" She nodded. "I don't want to wait until it's needed." He walked over, brushed a thumb along her cheekbone. "You won't have to do any of it alone." "I know," she said. That night they lay with her back against his chest, her fingers tracing the calluses of his hand. I used to think I'd never trust anyone again, she whispered. But it wasn't trust I lost. It was the feeling that someone would meet me halfway. He kissed the curve of her shoulder. I'll always come to meet you. The days shortened. Snow deepened in the gullies. They kept to their rhythm, marking time with the small things: how many logs were left in the stack, how thick the ice formed on the water bucket, how much her cheeks flushed when the wind picked up. And then, one morning, she stood at the basin and turned to him with a smile so soft it almost undid him. "It's time," she said. The months that followed moved slower. She rested more, and he took on the heavier work without question. He carved a cradle from pine, sanded it smooth, and carried it inside without a word. They didn't speak often about it. They didn't need to. When the baby came, it was a cold night in late May. The midwife from the South Ridge arrived just after dark, and by dawn there was a new cry in the cabin. A girl with dark hair and wide, curious eyes. Glenna held her close, her face damp with effort and joy. Zep crouched beside the bed, one hand wrapped around theirs. "You did it," he whispered. "You both did." Glenna looked at him, exhausted and glowing. "Her name's Mercy." He kissed her forehead, then the baby's. "That's just right." They planted a tree behind the house that week, a young cottonwood with roots bound in burlap. Zep dug the hole, Glenna poured the water, and together they pressed the earth back into place. Years passed like that. Quietly, with care. The fence lines grew longer, the herd larger. Mercy learned to walk between the rows of beans and sleep through the howl of wind on winter nights. Glenna taught her to read by the hearth, and Zep showed her how to hold a bridle without fear. They built a life not from what they'd escaped, but from what they chose: daily kindness, steadiness, the slow, deliberate joy of people who had known pain and still believed in peace. And when the river ran high in spring and the cottonwoods leafed again, Zep would take Glenna's hand on the stoop, lean close, and say the same thing every year without fail. "I'd still have pulled you from that water." Every time. And she'd smile, tuck her head beneath his chin, and answer, "I'd still have taken your hand. Always."